Viewers, welcome to TV Metro Mail. You are watching Chit Chat. I am Emamul Haque, your host today. People around the world, they are not, they are very frustrated. They are frustrated because they see war around them. We don't want war. People don't want war. Despite all this, we see war around us. That's why they are frustrated. Many of us, many of the other people from different part of the world, they are saying whether they are asking themselves whether UN is performing or whether UN is gradually losing its ability or capacity to prevent conflicts and protect our peace and security in the world. So we will be discussing this all today, and I am joined by Professor Dr. Imtiaz Hussain. Let me bring him on screen first, and then thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Professor Imtiaz Hussain.
Good morning from Dhaka, and it's good to be on your show. Topic is very interesting and probably a little much on the headlines today. So I'm curious as to how you all in Canada feel about issues that probably have a very different angle to them here.
Dr. Professor Imtiaz is the founder of Global Studies and Governance Program at Independent University, Bangladesh, and he has been teaching there since 2016. He is a former professor of the Philadelphia University, USA. Professor Imtiaz Hussain taught wide-ranging international relations, global studies, governance courses at various universities in Southeast Asia and North America, and his scholarly article has been published in number of reputed globally professional journals. So, and I have with us our regular the panelist Shaikat. Rushdee, many of you know him, that he is a political and media analyst, and he has a long career. Before that, he was working with the BBC as a journalist. And we have Christina Rozario. Christina Rozario is a development worker. She is a good orator as well, and she works for a university in USA. So welcome you all today, and let me start with a very specific question. Since we will be talking about UN, because many people they have expressed their concern whether UN is failing or whether is gradually UN, particularly UN Security Council, is gradually become inefficient platform to protect peace and security in the world. So, do you see any systemic issues inside the UN Security Council which you need to address to make the UN Security Council or the UN better or more efficient or more, to enhance their capacity?
It's a good question. Let's look at it another way. Um, Suppose there is no United Nations, we would be in even worse mess than we are in right now. It was created, the Atlantic Charter 1942, and it was done by two countries, Great Britain and the United States. So then it had an Anglo-Saxon origin, and that has not been given up. During the war conferences, World War II, I think President Roosevelt, United States, developed a good friendship with his Soviet counterpart, Joseph Stalin. And that camaraderie probably was even more than it was with Winston Churchill. And so when the war ended, just blowing up the two countries it began with into five was only a matter of logic and time. And the Soviet Union then became a part of it, China also, and France. So the old powers and the new powers, or the emergent powers, were there. So it had a military kind of a security basis, um, and then the advent of the Cold War just intensified that. And so we know it from all the vetoes that were cast, dominated by the Soviet Union at first. For example, up until the 1970s, it would cast something like 100 plus vetoes out of only 130 total vetoes of the United Nations. But since the 1970s, we see a balancing act between the two great powers there, the superpowers, United States and Soviet Union at first, but Russia since. We are seeing a balancing of the vetoes, and these reflect, I think, a lot of the concerns and the deadlocks that are not going to be easily broken. And certainly, what is happening with Gaza today, we are seeing that it is easing up in some respect, with just the United States on one side, and slowly we're seeing Great Britain paying more attention to the humanitarian than the United States is, that angle of the conflict. So we do see elements of changes, but we also see the old concerns perhaps even more intensified. And these get in the way of efficient outcomes. That's one angle. Another angle is from the 54 original members, we are now about 198, maybe 199 in terms of membership. So it's almost like a triple jump in members. And so you're going to get people and countries from many parts of the world with many different cultural expectations. Bulk of them are increasingly former colonies, so they have a different perception. And I think the first real protest, you might say, it was a mild protest, was the birth of the non-aligned movement. And although it was against the First World and the Second World, from 1955, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, from there the non-alignment conference opened up a third avenue where the less developed countries have been slowly expressing their dissatisfaction of the entire 1940s order. The United Nations was a big part of it because with it comes so many other organizations, 30 plus. And some of those organizations that don't deal with security have done really well. For example, the World Bank has helped Europe, West Europe, recover from the World War One, World War Two. So the Marshall Plan, similar plan for Japan, the Alliance for Progress with Latin America from 1962. All of these have produced growth in many places. And although it is being challenged by China and some of the institutions it is creating, World Bank, for example, against the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So these are logical and they are not really threatening. We can live to coexist in a kind of way if we can get over the security concerns that we have. And this is not happening easily. As you know, the amount of money being spent, what General Eisenhower called the military industrial complex in his farewell address 1961, from then that military industry complex has just grown. And today it is taking up much more time and much more money. That means we are preparing weapons to fight. If they're not sold through battles, the industry collapses. So without this security concern, it's going to be hard to finish all the other non-security issues like climate change. World Health Organization pulled us out of the pandemic. It doesn't get credit as much, but it did a huge, fantastic job to infuse a hope during some very bleak months of the pandemic. So there are some huge areas. How about getting rid of smallpox? It has done many things that would not have been possible without the UN system in place.
I
So,
understand that UN system is working, but today I think probably we'll focus more on UN Security Council because we are dealing with the peace and security. And
yeah,
the UN is working. We know we all see, but by this last couple of weeks, almost over 20,000 people have been killed in Israel-Gaza war, which is very frustrating for us. I think probably Christina, you have something to related to this, right?
Well, I wanted to step back from what Imam was saying, like, and go into in line with what you were saying. If we did not have, because health is not visible, illness is. So, if knowing human race as we are, without a United Nation, is it possible? And for me, I think United Nation is basically a club of nations and a club of governments of nations. If it is a club of governments and of nations, and there are stronger club members and weaker club members, larger, stronger, arms making players are taking over. And I mean, in a strange way, is the cost of peace lesser than it should be?
I think it's growing. It is growing, and it's not necessarily the UN's fault. For example, there are more United Nations emergency forces being deployed after the Cold War than there was before. And the number of missions have just skyrocketed. Just in this century, I think we have something like 15 plus. But in the Cold War, the beginning part of it, you didn't have that many. There were some big ones for which Canada became a big name, the symbol of peace. And I think Lester Pearson, for whom the Foreign Office is named in Ottawa, he got the Nobel Prize 1957 because of what he did. But since that time, the diminishing Canadian interest of the public on Main Street, their declining interest reflects, I think, the global declining interest. There's been a growth of number of ethnic conflict, especially in Africa. Africa was mostly created as states, artificial states. Now the tribes are trying to get their own autonomy back. So I don't think conflict is going to go away. We just need to work. One big area we do need to pay some attention to is the veto power. How do we come to terms with the veto power as it exists? Somehow, without negotiations between the great powers, in this case, particularly United States and China, that is going to be hard. And if they're fighting over trade, it's going to be a tough call to get some kind of a security agreement, especially on the veto.
Actually, I was just coming back to that veto power. Actually, we know that veto, making a decision against the majority people's voice, it stops, it hinders the majority people's voice, the veto, which is very undemocratic mechanism. And that is only controlled by five powers of the 193 plus members of the world body. And people still rely and keep trying to keep their faith on the UN system because this is the largest global organization. And our Bangladesh has a couple of experiences with veto. In 1971, when on December 3rd, when Pakistan and India joined the war, in our liberation war, then on the December 4th, there is a US resolution for ceasefire. But Russia or USSR vetoed that. That helped us. But in 1972 August, when Bangladesh applied for the United Nations membership, then again the China first time vetoed, and that was against Bangladesh membership. So we have been kicked in both sides. But my question is that by keeping this veto power, whether Security Council could be effective? And there are some questions that the Security Council enhancement you can increase, like Brazil, India, South Africa should also be permanent member by keeping this veto power, but and whether enlarging the Security Council members or not, whether it still helps saving people's life, saving peace in the world.
I think the answer to your question is very simple. Unless there is a workable alternative on the drawing board, nothing is going to happen. And no matter how you talk about, I mentioned non-alignment movement in the 1950s and 60s, but you have brought us to the more modern version of that, BRICS, for example. But the Ukraine war again shows the division. The entire BRICS, or what they call the global south, were not in favor of the Western powers in Ukraine. And the Western powers are not too happy about that. And so you have, on the one hand, India playing some kind of a broker, getting the military weapons from the United States, but also being the host of the G20 and the Global South movement, everything. So it's going to be very hard getting consensus. And until that consensus, the present status quo will stay. It's going to be very hard for any country to do it unless they can make peace in non-security issues.
And you can see also that in Ukraine has shown us, after the Ukraine war, which is still continuing, and the Gaza and Hamas war with Israel since October 7, still it is showing the hypocrisy of the permanent members. They are crying wolf when it is case of civilian casualty in Ukraine, but they are not crying wolf or crying anything. They are not supporting even. And one of the resolutions is now in the table, which is supposed to be voted yesterday, but it has been deferred because the word ceasefire cannot be accepted by Israel and USA. They want suspension of hostility, not ceasefire. So that kind of one or two words, change of words, how many people are losing their lives? How can we protect from that?
Yes, and this gets to the meat, I think, because, one issue is democracy, and democracy, as we are seeing, is more, survival. It permits survival of the fittest. And if the fittest is not quite ready to share that power with Main Street, it becomes very difficult. And the United States has been a big champion of it. But if you look at democracy in the United States, when did women get the right to vote? When did Afro Americans get the right to vote? These are all so late in the 20th century that to make it a symbol of democracy raises more questions than it answers. And I must say that 1776, the founding fathers, United States, were slaveholders. If the slaveholders can claim democracy and the world has followed everything they have said, United States is still seen, and in some cases rightfully so, as the standard bearer of democracy. But women got the right to vote. That's more than 50% of the population in 1920.
20.
And therefore, from 1776 to 1920, I mean, what was going on? What about Afro Americans? Yes, there was a civil war 100 years after 1776, but they did not get the right to vote until 1965. And if they got the right to vote, why do Afro Americans have to face something like Black Lives Movement now? So something is not working with democracy in the citadel of democracy.
True.
And unless we pay more attention to that, one answer could be that the Congress, Parliament in Great Britain, and perhaps also where you are, Canada, because Canada is pretty much siding up with those countries over Gaza. And what is happening is that whoever is getting whichever elected representative is getting more funds from certain groups, that's where the vote will go. And therefore, with the Gaza issue, both parties, Democrats, pro-labor Democrats, and conservatives, pro-business conservatives, they all agree on one thing, and they're all supporting Israel. And then those who've done study of this also can tell you how much money they have been paid by the name they use is AIPAC, the Arab Israel Political Action Committee, and so much money is being spent just to influence the vote. Universities, as happened with the University Pennsylvania, Harvard, the presidents, one of them resigning from my alma mater, and the other one under quite a lot of pressure because big business have given so much endowment that they can influence what the presidents or the universities do or say. If that is where education is headed, then we are really in a crisis. It's not just the parliament or the Congress, people being purchased for their vote. It is also the higher seats of education. And
I
therefore,
think,
if that is happening, tell me, where is democracy?
and I also had a question about one of the references you gave, that at one time Canada was the peacekeeper. And where was Canada? It's just an arbitrary question about the value of peace, of where it is. Which kind of conflict was Canada trying to appease with the peace process? And now that there are smaller countries, including Bangladesh, keeping peace, what areas and what kind of peace are they appeasing? And does it have the same kind of value? Is the is the weightage that, and that is why I've asked you the question about somehow um, peace and not peace, or conflict being normalized in a way in the psyche of people, that oh, certain places there is conflict all the time.
Well, it's a good question and it's something that I think is very relevant. Canadian involvement began with what we might call the granddaddy of Gaza today, and that is 1948, the Nakba, and the conflict that took place. Canada went straight for peacekeeping. It became a global synonym for peace, and it would stay that way for another almost 20 years. And so wherever there was a conflict, by the way, in 1948, Lester Pearson was helping out. And then when he became foreign minister, that's when the Suez Canal crisis happened, 1956. He managed that also as commander, so much that he got the Nobel Prize in 1957. So Canada's name, the shadow, the reputation was there. But somewhere inside Canada, the people were beginning to get more and more reluctant to send their own kids, next door neighbors, to fight for foreign countries. This began in the early 70s, and ironically, it began under Pierre Trudeau, who was basically one of the big advocates of moving away from superpowers. His third option, for example, was to move away from the first option, which is the United States, second option, which is Great Britain. He went to China and probably even before Henry Kissinger, but got less press coverage because he's Canadian. And therefore, that's when Canada really had a big name and became a symbol. It is still circulating in the world, but Canada has now shifted almost 180 degrees. The Afghanistan War, 2003, Canada sent combat troops. Big difference from peacekeeping and combat troops. So Canada is really turning around in a way that is puzzling other countries. And as you mentioned, Bangladesh, what are the countries looking after and supplying the troops for the UN emergency forces today? 3 South Asian countries, they are the leaders. India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. All 3 of them, roughly the same numbers, 8,000 plus they're giving troops. And the other part of the whole thing that gets to the second part of the question you asked, um, the number of peacekeeping missions have really expanded, especially in Africa. And even more surprisingly, 1990s, who would have believed conflict could come back to Europe? Bosnia Herzegovina, again, where Canada played a big role. I think the commander was the Canadian, and I think some Belgian troops were killed under that command. I think you need to look up the details, but Bosnia Herzegovina and then Africa. And this probably is the pointed answer to your question. How are these working out? We are finding more troops, UN troops today, committing violence. And they have been deployed, but issues like rape has been made and confirmed quite a few places in Africa. So in a way, the peace angel seems to have lost its chastity, if you get the image I'm trying to portray.
There is a geopolitical issues, here playing important role, and at the same time, as you said, and Shaikat and Christina also, you have said similar kind of thing, that there is some kind of absence in democratic values in the UN system, or UN, particularly UN Security Council. If that is the case, has the council been effective or in preserving the peace and security in this world?
I don't know. That's the million. Well, I think million is too little. $1 billion question.
Yeah.
It really is, because if we could, we'd all be living so much happier than we are at present, and we would have fewer finger pointing to do than we are doing now. Finger pointing is also distracting us from the end goal of peace. And the more we accuse each other, the farther we get from the solution. We cannot make paper-made, idealistic solutions. They have to work, because if it doesn't work, if it follows the UN model, 70 years, it's going to run into problems. I think somehow you have to start thinking about non-Security Council permanent members. And certainly with the amount of money that Israel is channeling into parliaments everywhere, could that also start affecting the United Nations? And this would be a power that has no military basis, it's financial power, and it might be a lot of Zionist money. And so it's not just security antagonism, but there's a financial component that has entered the picture.
And I was just thinking that you said the Zionist money. What is the source of that Zionist money?
As you can see in front of you in many of the newspapers, so many corporations that would give money, for example, to Harvard and to the University of Pennsylvania, they're withdrawing that money. So you get the names right there, the companies. I don't have them at the tip of my tongue, but I think you can just Google and find them all. And then a whole bunch of
The business.
companies have been listed. For example, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, of course, is the biggest. All of these that have been channeling, I think, customer, consumer interest in such a way that whatever they say kind of becomes public, it influences the public. And and McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Nike, whichever, and especially the movie halls, the Hollywoods. So you have huge influence, and through them you also have lots of financiers in New York. I don't have the names, but I think you can look them up. There are so many of them. Yeah.
I mean, my question was, isn't there a lesson to be learned from that too? That if there are agencies that are shaping people's opinions, and the counter is possible also, right? Like shaping, I mean, a little bit of questions here and there rising about civilian deaths in Gaza, and is it really necessary? I mean, what Israel does, it plays a narrative of yesteryear wrongs, almost legitimizing today's wrongs. So, I mean, a counter narrative and norm setting, because what we learned with the involvement of WHO in the health sector during COVID was unusual people getting together to talk to each other, who otherwise probably would not have. Pharmaceutical industries would probably not be speaking so much with community organizations to roll out COVID vaccines. So, like all these unusual people coming together to discuss, is could something like that happen? Is there a way to move strategically to create like the norm setting so that the other narrative also has a counter narrative?
We have to do it. We don't have a choice, and history backs us up. If you go back 100 years, the League of Nations was going through a similar plight, and people were asking the same questions as you are asking now of the United Nations. And they did not give up on the League of Nations, even though it was being abandoned and, in a way, violated so badly. Uh, what they did was pick up the ashes, the Atlantic Charter 1942. They tried to regroup in a different way. We will have to do something like that if a catastrophe affects us. That catastrophe can come from military. Certainly, what's happening in Gaza now could be one example of how it could deteriorate if and only if the United States or Great Britain don't change their positions on the ceasefire. That could easily happen. So we must keep an eye on the Egyptian attempt to bring Hamas and Israel together for another round of talk and a truce from the ceasefire, which is under discussion right now. So we need to keep working on it, and somehow we also need to keep other actors. China, for example, India can also play a big part because it has just concluded a treaty in the G20 in New Delhi in September this year, a road which is going through Gaza to Europe. It's a corridor, a Middle East corridor connecting with Europe, a counterpart to the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative of China. And one argument there is that there's a gas, lot of gas in Eastern Mediterranean along the Levant. And therefore, even the US estimates 10, 12 years ago, geological surveys indicated there could be $120 trillion worth of oil, gas. And therefore, if that is the reason why this is happening, we just have to play. We have to play and see where it takes us, because that complicates things. If Gaza is completely cleared of the um, residents, not just Hamas, the majority of the people, as it's
Yes,
happening, the cleansing that is happening, if
yes,
that happens, it feeds the economic motivation, the gas based motivation. Also, going on is a talk to have an alternative to the Suez Canal. And that alternative also goes through the south part of Gaza. And so it's a very explosive moment. Many plans are on the drawing board for exploiting it this way or that. We need to put the heated minds together for some negotiation.
We understand that the previously military power was the final say. Now the economic power is having the final say almost in every aspect of our life, and the human lives doesn't matter. The resources matter. Like Pakistan is wanted to clean out East Pakistan. They need the land, not the people. And in Gaza, Israel and Western powers want the land, not the people. So the human lives doesn't matter. It seems to be right.
Yes, unfortunately, that is how it is. And we've been trying. It was about 110 years ago that the first Hague peace conferences began. Um, the mission continues. We have to look at every way that we can, and bringing some heavyweight, less developed countries like India, Brazil, South Africa into the picture might help dilute it without necessarily giving them the veto equivalent.
Actually, the question of the accountability when there is some war crimes happening or crimes against humanity happening, the United Nations plays a role of a referee sort of thing. We have seen in some aspects, but not all aspects. Like only the ICC, the International Criminal Court, punished some African leaders and formerly socialist East European leaders, not any Western powers or any other people. On the other hand, the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court in 1998, USA, Israel, and five other countries, in total seven countries, are not signatories. So they don't care. So is there any accountability, like what is happening in Israel and Gaza war? Is there any accountability? Can we or United Nations hold responsible for crimes against humanity to anybody at all?
It's a good question, another $1 billion question, and I think the answer should be very straightforward. We cannot say no to that. We have to find a way out. And the only way that this will work, it might not be the best form of government, but the spillover effects of it really sinks in, and that is democracy. I earlier mentioned how it is survival of the fittest. Everyone gets the same opportunity, but those with the most resources win. Yes, but we have to start putting in checks and balances on that. And that democracy, 100 years ago, who would even be talking about it? We had what we in academia call that the second wave of democracy. The first having begun 100 years before in Great Britain. That's the second wave. Today, we've talked about the fourth wave, which is the Arab Spring 10 years ago, the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth. And the fifth wave is the Muslim wave. And Muslims are not clean and clear on this because out of 57 countries, Muslim countries, you tell me how many are backing up Gaza today? The
Can
biggest ones are not.
can we be optimistic from one point, one lesson we learned from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? That was USA actually declined initially, and still it has won the hearts of people and the other governments. Can we learn any lesson from there that we can press on the United Nations decision-making process like IPCC?
Yes, I think your Secretary General, United Nations, he's been trying it so badly. And so I think gentlemanly, he's been voicing many issues. He's given, it was over the pandemic. Instead of attacking everyone, he was trying to pacify with especially United States and the economic forces. He's doing it even now with Gaza. He's the one standing up. He's not being heard, but he doesn't give up. And
True.
neither should we. We must keep saying it. And as I was mentioning about democracy, ultimately it will trickle down to Main Street, and people will start thinking about it. For example, right now, unofficial polls say people are moving away from the position the United States and Great Britain are taking because they don't like what they see: women, children being killed, hospitals being destroyed. There's not a single hospital left in Gaza. These are triggering people. Next year is a big election year, and we have to keep an eye. Great Britain, United States, we also have elections. And I think Canada is approaching its own election. So we need to see how people, the issues right now are so pregnant, they're not going to die by then. They will be influencing the outcome. And in that way, we get a sense of whether going to mainstream might be the best way out to salvage the Security Council and the United Nations. Instead of having conferences, Atlantic Charter, ownership, Roosevelt, Churchill, now go to Main Street and use the democratic vote to push pressure on the elected officials.
Very much. Thank you very much, Professor Imtiaz Hussain. It's time to conclude our show, but before we conclude, we'd like to know from you that what do you have to say to them? As I said earlier, when in the beginning of the show, that people are frustrated. We are frustrated seeing all this war around us, as if the world is on fire. So, what do you have to say to those people, those who are frustrated about the UN role or UN, the way it is working? Do you have any specific thing to share with them?
Yes, but it's so long term, I don't think anyone will pay attention. All I can say is that election time is coming. Check out your candidate. And if possible, let your candidate know that what you're doing is not right. If enough people do it in countries that claim to be democratic, you might be able to make some change. Nothing will happen suddenly. Nothing will happen if we just click our fingers. And so we have to work slowly. At some point, either the economy will collapse and then people will start moving away from policies that have helped the business. In this case, Gaza, if that argument is correct, that there is an economic reason. For example, Israel can detect nuclear weapons in Iran and even bomb those plans, but it could not detect anything on its own border with Hamas on October 7th. So these are questions that we need to talk to our elected official who we vote for, and we need to tell them. For even it's happening even in Israel. The Zionists and the Jews are very different people. The Jewish people are very much on the side of humanitarianism. They didn't like what happened October 7th. Neither do they like what's happening in Palestine.
That's right.
So we need to cultivate that and prevent the bad apples from speaking for the flock.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Imtiaz Hussain. Thank you very much, Christina Rozario and Shaikat Rushdee. Viewers, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you all, and especially for inviting me to this. I wish you the best, and I wish peace based on the United Nations, even more the best.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.